Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I will invite our panelists to turn on their cameras if they're ready, and we will get started with today's webinar on how federal CAAQS informs air quality. So good afternoon again. My name is Julie Kusiek, and I'm the Communications and Engagement Coordinator for West Central Airshed Society and Alberta Capital Airshed. I'd like to acknowledge that we are all treaty people. West Central Airshed and Alberta Capital Airshed are located on Treaties 6 and 8 and Métis Nation Zone 4. I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land on which you join us from today. So welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar, How Federal CAAQS Informs Air Quality. Today's webinar is actually a bit special because it kicks off the Clean Air webinar series. This will be a series of monthly webinars put on jointly by West Central Airshed and Alberta Capital Airshed. We are calling it the Clean Air webinar series as a nod to the pre-pandemic in-person conferences that Alberta Capital Airshed used to put on. Those were called the Clean Air Forum. This webinar series is one way of continuing to build knowledge and momentum around air quality monitoring in the region, while reducing travel time and connecting to wider audiences via an online platform. We hope you enjoy it. After the webinar, we will also be sending out a feedback form. We'd appreciate if you took a couple of minutes to let us know what you thought so that we can continue to improve this as we go throughout the months of 2022. You can follow along for updates on future webinars via the West Central Airshed and Alberta Capital Airshed social media accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also join our monthly newsletter list at capitalairshed.ca and WCAS, WCAS.ca. I'd also like to acknowledge those working behind the scenes to put on today's webinar. We have Gary Redman, the Executive Director for both Alberta Capital Airshed and West Central Airshed. We have Russ Miyagawa on technical support and Serena Tang, who will be live tweeting today's webinar. For today's webinar on how federal CAAQS informs air quality, we have two speakers, Maxwell Mazur and Dr. Kevin McCullum. I will just ask for Russ, if you could please allow Maxwell to turn on his camera. He can say hello as I give him a little introduction here. So Maxwell Mazur is Red Deer, North Saskatchewan Region's Senior Air Quality Specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks Resource Management Section of Resource Stewardship Division's Airshed and Watership Stewardship Branch. He has studied at the University of Alberta, where he received his Bachelor of Science, and the University of Toronto, where he received his Master of Science. In the past, he has worked for Environment Canada in Edmonton, where he completed research on atmospheric mercury near coal-fired power plants. He has been in his current role with Alberta Environment and Parks for 7 years, and has spent much of that time working towards understanding the formation of fine particulate matter in the capital region, as well as assisting the development of management actions for the management of air quality. Welcome, Maxwell, and thank you for coming today. We're just working on that video piece, and we'll welcome Maxwell's happy face in a moment or two.
Yeah, no worries. I can do it either way. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Don't really have to go too much into any more detail, I guess. I wanted to speak a little bit, I think, is my screen still sharing or did it cut out?
You know what, Maxwell, what I'll do is I'll introduce Kevin, go through some housekeeping, and then we'll get started with your presentation.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yep. So Kevin is a senior environmental engineer and the data manager for West Central Airshed and Alberta Capital Airshed. Kevin holds a PhD and Master of Science in Environmental Engineering from the University of Alberta, with specialties in ambient air quality and river water quality. Kevin was part of the Environmental Protection and Planning Committee, EPPC, of the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, CCME, during the inception of the Air Quality Management System, AQMS, which included which included the updates to the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards, CAAQS, or CAAQS as we're calling it. As you can see, there are a lot of acronyms involved, which Kevin will be keen to tell us more about soon. He has worked much of his career in the air quality monitoring field with air zones throughout Western Canada, focusing on air quality data analysis and interpretation, monitoring and instrumentation, as well as dispersion and transport modeling. Kevin also works closely with universities, working collaboratively with University of Alberta, University of Regina, and First Nations University, and has a passion to deliver partnerships and monitoring research capabilities. Welcome, Kevin. And I also have to say that the photo that you provided to us with, that we could use for our advertising materials had those fantastic scientist glasses. And I just think that sets a great tone. So thank you for that. So welcome, Kevin. With our housekeeping, here's how the rest of this hour will go. Each Maxwell and Kevin will give a 10 to 15 minute presentation. Questions from webinar participants are welcome and encouraged. I encourage you to use the Q&A function, not the chat box. That Q&A function just allows me to make sure that I am capturing each of your questions, and I will facilitate those questions at the end of both presentations. Also, there are no bad questions. We have participants joining us from a variety of backgrounds, and we all come with a different level of background knowledge. So ask away. And hello, Maxwell. There, we got the camera working. Thanks, Russ, and hello, Maxwell. I would also like to advise that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared to both the Alberta Capital Airshed and West Central Airshed Society website and social channels. So with that, let's get started. So Maxwell, would you like me to introduce a bit more about your presentation, or you want to just get right to it? So I'll share that, Maxwell, if you could just try your mic to.
Sorry, yeah, no, I was muted. I can start away. No problem going. Probably more time for questions then. Just confirming you can see my screen.
Yes, it all looks great. Thank you.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards, or CAAQS, mean for the management of air quality, specifically in Alberta's capital region. So it's where I'm based. I'm based in Edmonton, and where I do most of my work. And so it's close to home and close to heart, and very interesting to learn. So hopefully I can give you a background on just how we use the CAAQS and how they influence how we manage ambient air quality in the capital region. So really briefly, and this presentation has some clickable links. So depending on how we share the presentation or things like that, we can either share the links or things like that. But most of the documents and things like that I'll link to, or that are in the presentation as like little pieces off to the side, can really be found pretty easily through our open .alberta.ca, where a lot of our public documents live. So how are CAAQS being implemented in Alberta? Well, we have one sort of guiding piece of policy. It's this Alberta implementation of the Air Zone Management Framework for Fine Particulate Matter and Ozone, which really details how we are going to implement the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards. The current document was released in 2015. We're undergoing update, and I'll speak to why that is, I guess, in a second. But a new version of this document with some updated information will be released probably in the next year or so. But the key core functions of the document is that it really talks about how management levels for the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards are determined, talks about what stations are used for reporting against those standards, and it talks about some general and high-level guidance about how we would go about air zone management. So once we know what the management level is with respect to each different pollutant, what do we do next? And I'll probably talk a little bit about what some of the keys of those are a little bit later. I guess the thing to note is that we've been managing against the fine particulate matter and ozone CAAQS for a number of years now, since 2015. For the 2018 to 2020 data period, so as of 2020, there are some more stringent fine particulate matter and ozone Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards that are coming into play, as well as some new Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards for nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide. So that's the reason for the update of this document, to just include those pollutants. Generally, not a whole lot will change other than just incorporating those details. Where can you find this information? So this information is pretty easily available on our website. Again, there's several ways you can find your way here, but basically if you go to open.alberta.ca and search for Alberta Air Zone reports, you'll get a listing of our available air zone reports. So what happens in these reports is monitoring data is evaluated against the CAAQS threshold. So there's a number of different thresholds, a lower, medium, and high threshold, and that defines 4 different management levels. So there's a green management level, a yellow management level, an orange management level, and a red management level. I'll talk a little bit about what those mean in the next slide. But overall, the concentrations that are measured in the capital region are compared to those thresholds and a management level is assigned. The next step that happens is there is an opportunity for, and this is consistent across all Canadian jurisdictions, for transboundary flows. So things that are air pollutants that are coming across a provincial boundary, so from other provinces or even the United States, and exceptional events, so things like forest fires or other major pollutant events have a chance to be removed if they're determined to influence the management level. The reason for this is we want to take consideration of things that are within control within Alberta jurisdiction. So we want to make sure that forest fires in another jurisdiction are removed from these assessments because they would adversely impact how we would manage air quality and aren't really reflective of what we can control within our jurisdiction. Within these reports, there's a lot of details of what's removed and how it goes about, but generally speaking, there's a lot of evidence that needs to be provided and a lot of detail of how we would go about actually determining what is an exceptional event or transboundary flow. So please consult these if you have any questions. There are 6 reports available starting from the 2011 to 2013 data period and going all the way up to the 2017 to 2019 data period. Our report for the 2018 to 2020 data period is probably forthcoming here in the next number of months. So what are the management levels in the Alberta Capital Airshed? So Julie mentioned that I was the air specialist for the North Saskatchewan and Red Deer regions. So in the province, we have regional boundaries that are part of our land use framework, our land use framework. And so there's a number of different regions in the province, and these are used for land use planning purposes. The North Saskatchewan region is where the capital region is located, kind of right in the middle of the North Saskatchewan region. And in the province, we've aligned our air zones with the regional boundaries. So that's in the first document that I mentioned, the policy document that kind of outlines how we do that. It makes it a little bit more straightforward for how we manage things at a high level. So I guess the key thing to note is just that when you're looking at these maps, and these are maps that I've pulled from the reports in the last slide, you can get a sense of where the capital region is. Really, the key thing I want you to take away from this slide is that there are a number of different management levels. This is showing fine particulate matter and ozone. The green color is areas where we look at actions for keeping clean areas clean. The yellow level is looking at actions for preventing air quality deterioration. So understanding if there's any trends or things like that that are happening. Orange level is looking at taking actions to prevent us from exceeding the CAAQS, and the CAAQS are exceeded when we're in the red management level. And that's for when we actually look at implementing management actions to help us achieve the CAAQS, so to get below the CAAQS value. The kind of big takeaway from this level of, or this progression, is that the stringency and urgency of management actions increase as you go up that scale. So when it comes to these 2 pollutants, the stations in the Alberta Capital Airshed and broadly the larger capital region in general, so outside the Alberta Capital Airshed as well, have consistently crossed into the threshold into the orange management level for both ozone and fine particulate matter. So you can see consistently across this map of time periods. And even if you were to go and consult previous data periods, we're consistently in that orange management level. So we need to be taking actions to prevent a CAAQS exceedance. And the way that we implement that is that when we're in the red or orange management levels, we develop a management response as part of that approach. When it comes to where do we expect to be for nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide, we will be reporting these right away. This is where we anticipate that we'll be based on some historical data, but essentially stations in the Alberta capital airshed, as well as again some of the other stations in the capital region as well. We anticipate that they're going to be in the orange management level for nitrogen dioxide. So we're going to have to take some action on that pollutant as well. So 3 pollutants are in our wheelhouse. At the moment, sulfur dioxide is fairly well managed. It's largely an industrial pollutant, and at the moment we're in that yellow management level, which means we need to be taking care of trends and doing some long-term management, but the urgency isn't quite there yet to be doing a management response. So what do we know about those pollutants of concern? The main pollutants of concern, like I mentioned, are fine particulate matter, ozone, and nitrogen dioxide, and they're all regional in nature, and I'll describe what I mean by that in a second. On the right of the slide is just a colored example of fine particulate matter concentrations as predicted by a modeling tool that we use. Basically, the kind of more orange through red and into the kind of purple colors in the center of the city you get, the higher the fine particulate matter concentrations there are. But as you can see, the ring of the Anthony Henday and then broader as you go out, you can get a sense of where the Alberta capital airshed sits in that area, as well as the broader capital region. And just note that there's high concentrations throughout, not just in the city of Edmonton, but in surrounding communities as well. And there's a number of things that contribute to that. So we have upwind sources that contribute to regional background concentrations. So like some of my previous work, things like coal-fired power plant, upstream oil and gas activities, there's a large number of those. There's also urban sources that contribute to high concentrations of some pollutants. Things like nitrogen dioxide are really driven by combustion, both through transportation and heating and things like that. And those are highest really in the city center and downwind of the city. And then there's also some transportation and transformation of pollutants that happen as a result of, and result in high concentrations downwind of the city. So this is where we get transformation of things like nitrogen dioxide into pollutants like fine particulate matter and ground level ozone. So pollutants that are emitted in one place actually can result in high concentrations elsewhere in the region. So we have to take this as a regional issue because there are high concentrations, not just within the Alberta capital airshed. There's a large number of sources that contribute to those pollutants, and they come from a variety of sectors. So I have some figures. This is pulled from modeling work again. Don't want to get into it in too big a detail, but what I want you to take away is that there's a large number of sectors represented. There's kind of an urban fraction where you might think that the Alberta capital airshed is kind of centered on, and then some downwind information, which is where you might consider sort of east of Edmonton, northeast of Edmonton, that sort of thing. But in both cases, there are a large contribution from the other category, which is things like transportation, other forms of fuel combustion, like I mentioned, with heating and things like that. And other things like dust can contribute as well. But there's also a significant contribution from industry, things like upstream oil and gas, coal-fired power generation, and even some contributions from agriculture. And I guess the big takeaway from these pie charts is just that there's a number of sectors that contribute. There's not just one sector that's contributing to the high concentrations we observe. And the other key thing is that nitrogen dioxide is a key pollutant for management. I kind of mentioned this in the previous slide, but nitrogen dioxide is not only a pollutant itself, so we need to manage it itself, but it's a significant contributor to fine particulate matter and ground level ozone. So it can transform into fine particulate matter, especially in the wintertime. And in the summertime, on hot days, it can help catalyze the transformation of oxygen into ground level ozone. How are we managing these pollutants of concern? In 2015, we developed the capital region PM 2.5 response, and that was developed in response to some measured high concentrations of fine particulate matter. As I mentioned, we've measured high concentrations of fine particulate matter for many years. And so the reason for this was to build a response to what we were going to do to help bring those concentrations in line and to make sure that we don't exceed standards in the future. It's a science-informed response, and so it identified the management of NOx as a priority. As I mentioned, NOx being the broader category of nitrogen oxide, which is just NO, and nitrogen dioxide, which is NO2. Management actions are ascribed to a number of different sectors. And if you read through the response, it's fairly obvious what those different sectors are. And we have specific management actions that look at reducing pollutant concentrations and limiting the emission of them. Some additional actions to better our knowledge, which we classify as investigation actions, and then some engagement actions to help increase awareness and bring more action on developing the other two actions. Since 2014, fine particulate matter and ozone, like I said, continue to require management, and we are expecting that nitrogen dioxide is going to require management as a pollutant itself. But not only it is a significant contributor to those other pollutants. So to do that, we started a comprehensive pollutant management workshop series in 2018 with our key stakeholders. It's mentioned down at the bottom, I guess, but in the capital region, we have a committee of multi-sector, we have a multi-sector stakeholder committee called the Oversight Advisory Committee, and they help us implement the capital region air quality management framework. It includes industry, public, airsheds, municipalities, and government. And the purpose of that committee is to help us build actions to manage air quality. So as part of this workshop series, we wanted to make sure we update the implementation of the actions in the PM 2.5 response. That was from 2014. We wanted to demonstrate actions on managing ozone. So it was something that hadn't been, we'd focused really heavily on fine particulate matter. We wanted to make sure we also considered ozone, as well as we wanted to anticipate the need to manage nitrogen dioxide as a pollutant. And through that, we helped develop comprehensive management actions that would effectively manage the issue. So building implementable management actions with high efficacy. And so we're still building what that looks like and what specific actions we're going to be implementing, but focusing on things that will make tangible changes in emission levels and ultimately ground level concentrations. This is my last slide. Oops. What are the next steps in managing to the CAAQS? So as I mentioned, there's many sectors involved. And so one of the key sectors that we are looking for and looking at managing is non-point sources. So non-point sources are things like the images on the side, things like light duty vehicles, which is you and I, vehicles that we use sort of every day, heavy duty transportation like trucking, home heating, and there's a wide category of other things that fit into this, but those are some easy ones to mention. The challenge is that these aren't, many of these aren't regulated by Alberta Environment and Parks or any one specific agency. So we need a lot of cross-jurisdictional actions to impact those sources. So right now we're working within government to engage a number of other ministries. So things like Alberta Transportation, Agriculture and Forestry. There's a big list of folks that we're helping to work with. And we're also helping to implement the Clean Air Strategic Alliance recommendations on non-point sources where applicable. So I recommend you go take a look at that organization's report on non-point sources, because there's a lot of good multi-stakeholder input on those specific actions. And we're also looking at building tools to help enable stakeholders to take action. So one of the things we're building is a toolkit with actions that have been implemented in our jurisdiction as well as others to help folks take action. And we're also having sector-specific discussions on comprehensive management actions that will come. So we're slowly working through different sectors to help refine which actions will be most effective. And ultimately, we're going to be prioritizing and finalizing as much of this comprehensive pollutant management strategy as possible and releasing it likely later in 2022. So with that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Maxwell. I see that one question did come in the Q&A. So I guess we can go to that one question and then we'll leave any other questions for after Kevin's presentation to make sure we kind of get that overview of both of them together. So this question is from Rocky Farrow. She says, I worry the only urgency results in planning. Is there ever a permit that is not approved or a hard stop or any call for intervention along the planning process? She says, this is a harsh question, I know, but with knowledge comes responsibility. And the Stockholm Resiliency Center, John Rockstrom et al. Tell us planetary boundaries are being exceeded. How hopeful are you regarding current planning?
It's a good question. I think in the management of some sources, we're further along than others. One significant piece of work that I am undertaking is taking a look specifically at the industrial sector and what we can do to manage. And I guess without giving too much away, I think there are a number of things, a number of steps that we haven't taken that we can take before we start or we get to that level of like we can't accept anything else. I think what that means is if we're true to our commitment to reducing pollutants at source and things like that, there's a significant amount of work we can continue to do to continue to reduce pollutants at source before we have to start really either considering other pathways or something like that, or curtailing growth or things like that. So it's a challenge. It's going to take concerted effort from many different sectors to continue to reduce pollutants at source. But I think the ultimate benefit is that we should see not only less pollutants emitted, at least locally, the ground level concentrations locally should continue to decrease over time. And we're already seeing this in some things like nitrogen dioxide, but I think as we continue to focus more heavily on this, and the CAAQS will get more stringent in the future, we're just going to continue to see those concentrations slowly decrease. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks so much, Maxwell. So with that, I think we'll jump to the next section of today's webinar, and then we'll put you back on the hot seat there with more questions. I know that I have a small list ready to go. So before we get to Kevin's presentation, I'd like to also take a moment to explain the role of airsheds. So this webinar series is put on by 2 airsheds, and airsheds are multi-stakeholder nonprofit organizations that monitor air quality. We collect data and report on that data to the public as well as to government. You are learning about some of that role today. And for more explanation, I'll include a neat little 2-minute video on airsheds into the chat. And for anybody watching the recording, you can find this video on the West Central Airshed Society and Alberta Capital Airshed websites. So with that, I'm passing the mic over to you, Kevin. Would you like me to do another brief introduction of your presentation, or you want to get straight to it?
No, that's quite all right. I can get right to it. I can jump into it. I'm hoping I don't have too much information here. So thank you so much for giving the chance to present. If I look a little distracted, I'm actually giving a midterm to 26 engineers right now. So I'm watching multiple screens to make sure everything's good to go. The one thing that I joked about earlier on was the use of acronyms. That was one thing that we really do like to use quite a bit of. And so I'll try and explain every one of them. I know often we have an acronym jar that I have to put a loony or toonie into to try and compensate for that one. So just a quick overview. One of the things that we see is a map on our left here is the air sheds. So all of the air sheds and the monitoring stations are in green, whereas the land use frameworks are just on the right-hand side. So there you can see where some of them overlap. If I put them, the colors would just blend together. But I threw the Alberta Capital Airshed just as an outline in blue to see on both of them, just so you can see where it lays out. But this is how the two kind of airshed air zones kind of come together. I said I would take a little bit of a history lesson for this one. So I worked with the Ministry of Environment in Saskatchewan for many years, and it was the start of the AQMS and the whole process of the CAAQS leading up to it. So just in that history, one of the things that came about was in 2012, the Ministers of the Environment, so the CCME, really put the gears together to say we wanted this air quality management system forward, and we wanted the CAAQS really as the driver to set the limits going forward. So in that, one of the things that we had is the CAAQS were giving us that intent to try and bring the air quality across the country into the same jurisdictions, like in the same quality. And that was really the impetus of going forward. So when we started setting the framework for this, it was the Air Quality Management Committee, or the Air Management Committee, that really was the driver for this one. So much like what Max was talking about earlier, right at the national stage, we had developed a multi-stakeholder CAAQS development working group, so that CDRWG group. And they were tasked with coming back to the ministers with all of the information pertaining to the SO2, the NO2, so the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen dioxide, the fine particulate, and the ozone for CAAQS. And this was all of the background information. And it wasn't telling the stakeholder group to go and do the work themselves. We worked across the country on this in every jurisdiction to try and give as much information and to try and go forward with it. But ultimately, it was this group of 5 to 6 representatives from industry, and the same thing from non-government organizations, health organizations, environmental organizations, and Aboriginal organizations to be part of this group. So when this was done to help drive some of these improvements, we made sure that we had a time frame set in there so that every 5 years we would revisit and try and make sure that the levels are at the right levels based on our current scientific information. So you'll often see some of the numbers as they're published right now. It'll be in the 2015, 2020, 2025 timeframe. So that's how that came about to get us into that 5-year cycle. And it's an easy thing to let go if you don't actually have a forced target to keep it in there. So we had that target set for the 4 parameters. So like as we sit forward right now, so the 2018 to 2020 will be the first year that we'll be reporting on the SO2, like the sulfur dioxide and the nitrogen dioxide. And Max had already talked about it, that saying that we set these 4 color-coded levels to move forward with and give us that ability to get some sort of management action in there, where we didn't want to be in the red or the orange level in particular, but it gave us tools to go forward. So at the national stage, this is what we had set up so that we had that the green level where we had keeping clean areas clean, and then we moved up as each target level reached up. One of the things that we were concerned about was not allowing people or not allowing that pollute up to levels. So for example, if we're right now sitting in a yellow level and we have at least 2 or 3 ppb before we hit orange, then we can pollute up to orange. But the intent was that we didn't do that. We tried to make sure that we keep it in a management level before we go forward, and really allowing these triggers to keep it that way. So one of the things that really drives a lot of this information is good air quality data. We need to make sure that the data is in excellent condition, because that's how we're going to know when we're reporting on the CAAQS. If we do not have good data, we're not going to have good reporting. So it really takes a lot of people and a lot of effort to keep the air quality data in tip-top shape. So that's one of the big things and the big pushes for this one, and making sure that we do have this going forward. I'm not going to bore you with some of these ones, but you can see that there's a lot of information that's collected and transcribed over the years. So we make sure that if anything does stand out, we know what it is and move forward with it. Because as Max was talking about some of the transboundary issues, this is like you have certain peaks that occur during wildfire events. We want to make sure that they're accounted for, and we're not held to manage something like that from wildfires coming from other jurisdictions. Some of the considerations that we had, and this is just to identify it for the CAAQS as well, is that really one of the #1 factors that we put into this was the health and environmental impacts. That's the foundation of the numbers that you're seeing that have been put forward for CAAQS levels. The other one is standards really across Canada and across other global agencies. What are the current levels? So what is the current level for the World Health Organization? What is the current level for US EPA? What is the current level in other jurisdictions, European Union? So we're looking at different standards across the board to see where we sit in Canada to everyone else. And then from there, it was putting some of these guiding principles of continuous improvement into the AQMS, that we sure that that keeping clean areas clean was one of the things that stands fast. The other one is the past, current, and projected concentrations. So as Max had identified, that there are times that we see that there's certain projections that we know something's going to happen, so we start working towards it. And then the other one is the stability of the form of the standards. So it's just one of those ways that we can evaluate it and make sure that it's not influenced by strong meteorological events, and it's stable over longer time frames. But after all of these considerations, we still have to come up with an averaging time. So do we want it in hourly, 24-hour, annual? And I know when we work back and forth with Health Canada, some of the issues that was sub-hour, so 10-minute increments, 15-minute increments, but ultimately we settled back on the hour and 24-hour and annual. The next one was the actual standard itself, the numerical value that we came up with. And there's lots of information that's pertaining to this. To go through just for an example, for NO2 in particular, that was about 1.5 years of meetings back and forth throughout the country. and just to try and narrow down some numbers that we would all agree on. And then the form of the standard, again, as it sits. So the standard, it would be in a statistical process. So the 3 years you have to take into consideration, 98th percentile, or depending on which one you're talking about. But each one of them will have their own statistical value to calculate for the standard. It just makes it interesting. So ultimately, I have an identification of what does it mean to us? And what we need to be able to do is calculate these CAAQS metrics from all the reporting stations that we have. So all of the stations that we have in different air sheds, we can actually take all those values and calculate our CAAQS value from that. And depending if we have enough data, meets all the statistical requirements. Max talked about this one, the transboundary flow and the exceptional event. So we love the acronyms. Again, we have to start getting better ones that we can pronounce, but the guidance document on transboundary flow and exceptional events are one of the ones that we'd have to follow through to actually remove these data points. So just to see how things can play out. The other one is just then selecting the highest metric value in each of the air zones. So once we've calculated it all, which is the highest value, and that's the one that we take as our leading path forward. Whether we've removed the transboundary flow or the exceptional event or not. And then we have to determine what level we're at ultimately. Are we in the green level, the orange level, the yellow level, the orange level, the red level, and so forth. And then assign that management level to go forward. So being the typical PhD nerd, data nerd, one of the things that I was bored, and so I decided to do all the calculations for the 2018 to 2020 just to see where we're sitting at without removing any of the transboundary flows. I was curious to know where we would lay out. And so one of the things that I had focused on was the Alberta Capital Airshed to see. In particular, what are we seeing in this area compared to others? The graph at the top is probably pretty small for everyone to see, but it's just a layout of all of the stations the airsheds collect. And then where do each zone do they fall into? So in the North Saskatchewan, we have both ACA and West Central that are collected in there, but ultimately the ACA stations, there's a couple of them that fall into that yellow for SO2. Most of it's green. You can see the map on the left-hand side. Most of the province is green, but there are a few areas where we've got the yellow and then ultimately the red in orange in particular areas. But for us, it means that we're looking at a yellow management level. So in that sense, we're looking at that second lowest level and looking at having to come up with some sort of air quality improvement at the lower end and looking for the continuous improvement. In again, that green area, so if we look in particular where West Central is, in the upper Athabasca area, it's just the green area. So in that zone, we'll be looking at just the green management level moving forward for that one. And again, just keeping things clean. The next one we looked at is the NO2 calculations. And this is where, again, just kind of laying out where Max had showed it from the predictions that were pretty much orange across the province. There definitely are lots of orange dots in there. And again, you take the maximum for the zone. So if there is, for example, back to our upper Athabasca area, there's 3 orange and 1 green. We can't pick the green just because it's green. We have to pick the orange. We have to pick the highest. So in our area, of course, we're all orange for the NO2. And that's one of the ones that we're going to be looking at the second highest level of the air quality management. And as Max alluded to, there was lots of information on NOx and reasons why we're sitting at the orange level. The ozone is always kind of an interesting one because if you look across the top, we're floating very close to that red line, but we are in the orange for most of the jurisdictions, not all, but definitely in where we got the West Central and the upper Athabasca and in the North Saskatchewan, we're fairly orange. We have 1 yellow, but the orange would take precedence, being again that second highest. And then the last one I calculated, I actually did the 24-hour, but I didn't want to do the transboundary removal. So I thought, well, I'll look at the annual instead. And this is the plot of the annual data for the PM 2.5 for all of our stations. And we do end up having a few of the orange and red hits for annual, specifically in our area. And it's a fine line, like where you look at the annual numbers, the red has to be an annual average greater than 8.8 micrograms per cubic meter. So it's a very fine line for treading in that one. But ultimately, this is one of those ones that we would go back and look at the transboundary flows, especially during the extreme wildfire events. But ultimately, we have several of the stations that are either going to be in that orange or, again, potentially the red level going forward. So just as that snapshot, and I know the graph or the picture looks a little busy, but it was just a matter to say that we're looking continuously to review the data, review the monitoring, and make sure that where we're looking at for some of the development of the CAAQS to identify that everything is okay and that our stakeholders are given the best information and providing that clear path forward, and ultimately keeping that clean areas clean and not polluting up to the next level. I think, Julie, we were sharing these things as well. So I know Max shared some of the links. So I just put some of the links in here for some of the information as well, specifically for some of the CCME side, as well as for Alberta Environment's reports and where we're sitting for some of the zones. So that's where I've ended up.
Thank you, Kevin, for that presentation and for those links. And just so everybody knows, post webinar here, we will be sending out an email to everyone who registered with a whole list of all those links from both Kevin and Max's presentations. So I see that our Q&A has really lit up, which is great. I think the combination of these presentations has just been so fantastic. Kevin, I hope you didn't get too many students interrupting your train of thought as you were presenting.
I just keep looking over. I'm going, I actually hope they're actually downloaded the exam. That's what it really is sitting at right now.
Okay, so let's get to some questions here. The first question is, what does CAAQS look like in West Central Airshed Society? So who wants to take that one first?
Kevin, I think you had a bit of information on that.
Yeah.
I was just going to point maybe really quickly to, I'll just share my screen really quickly to this document. So this is table E from the most recent CAAQS assessment. But this shows a station by station assessment of the management levels for each station in the province. And then there's as Kevin mentioned, the highest level in that air zone for each air zone. And this takes into account transboundary flows and exceptional events. We don't have it yet for 2018 to 2020. I think Kevin did a really good job of showing where we might be in that level. This is the most recent one that we've released that takes into account transboundary flows and exceptional events. So as Kevin mentioned, Upper Athabasca and bits of North Saskatchewan region are part of West Central Airshed, but maybe I'll stop and let Kevin finish.
No, that's I was going to say, I can share the screen again if you want, just to see it, or if the answer was addressed. Let me just throw back to. So specifically for SO2, we definitely see for that Upper Athabasca, we're in the green, and really for the North Saskatchewan, it's just the West Central are all green on our outside. And it just isn't until you hit into the ACA that drives it into the yellow that we saw for SO2. NO2 is orange, yellow, orange, green. Like we have the cornucopia of the color, but orange is the driver because you pick the maximum. And the same thing with the ozone, where we were all orange for West Central, and then PM 2.5 again. It kind of skews it, and so that's why like Max, where we were talking about the transboundary and exceptional events, we have one station that's drove it into red and then two of them that are in green. So that immediately should raise different flags to say, to have such extremes on there, you've got the two ends of the spectrum that you want to be able to take a closer look at something like that. Hope that helps.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question here from David, who asks, while the CAAQS are a very positive air quality management instrument, they are not per se health effect based, like the recently updated WHO air quality guidelines. how does the province consider and reconcile the often significant difference between the CAAQS orange and red levels and no or minimal health effect levels as outlined in the WHO guidelines?
Retake that because I think the question is for the province, but it's a really good question. Thanks, David, for the question. I want to say it is a large consideration for the province, but I think it's something that we are working with. And Kevin gave a really good example of how the national level system and determination of CAAQS works. And there's a lot of conversations at this point between some of the work that Health Canada is doing and the update of the CAAQS for future years to, I think, reconcile that a little bit. I guess the short answer is that we're a little bit on the back foot in terms of looking at getting to the no or minimal effect level that the WHO has gone with. I think what the intent of the CAAQS is, and this is like way in the bowels of how they were set, but the idea is it's a population improvement approach. And Kevin can maybe expand on that, but the idea is basically that overall, as we go through time, that more and more of the Canadian population experiences an improvement in ambient air quality. And so some of the features of that is that the ambient air quality objectives, the CAAQS, get more stringent over time. The purpose of that is to try and lower ambient air quality concentrations that folks are exposed to, which will be shooting towards those lower values. I think it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It'll be something that we will probably take probably on that sort of generational time scale, but I think we are working towards that approach. And I think it's maybe important to note that it's not just something at the provincial level. We are working on implementing at the provincial level. So working towards building CAAQS management approaches and that kind of stuff as where we implement it, but the broader direction being those CAAQS values themselves, which are a Canada-wide conversation. Maybe I'll leave it and see if Kevin has anything to add.
I would just add the one thing. I know when we were looking at some of the numbers earlier on, you'd be going through different exercises of going, if we do, capture 75% of the population, they're exposed to this level. If we go to 85% of the population, they're exposed to this level. And you're trying to offset it to say, if we now give industry a chance, the 5-year time frame, the 10-year time frame to catch up, is that enough time for them to catch up in order to get us to the next level? And so we were doing that fine balancing act between both what's realistic and what's protective of the population. So it was an interesting, fun exercise for sure, but you definitely pulled your hair out quite a bit.
Good, thanks for that. I see that a new question popped up. I'm going to skip over a few of the other ones, sorry folks, and go to the latest one that popped up because I think it relates to the conversation that we're having right now, which is, how are the general public being informed about the state of Alberta's air quality and the CAAQS and that the CAAQS will be getting more stringent? What is the role of airsheds, the province, and others in this? So how do people find out about this and that it is becoming more stringent?
Maybe I can just really quickly speak to where we will be, I think, improving our. So if you look at that document that I shared, the air zone reports, they are fairly technical documents in nature. But as we get more comprehensive and a larger number of pollutants, it's a little bit harder to digest, especially if it's the general public. So we are working on some messaging to help with that sort of approach. So making sure that, if someone is interested in reading that approach, that there is a higher level summary and covering some of those ideas, right, about what does it mean around getting more stringent, those kind of ideas. There are a number of resources online, and I could probably point to them slowly over time, but we do have things like some fact sheets and stuff like that talk about generally just how the state of ambient air quality in the province. We did recently, the department just released a condition of environment website, which covers off some, I guess, more graphical ways of showing how ambient air quality is in the province, and maybe I can dig that up in a second. But again, if you Google condition of environment for Alberta, it likely will be something that comes up in your research results. There are a number of things that we are improving, and working with airsheds is also one of the things that we do on a regular basis, and partnering with airsheds. So airsheds are an important link of helping bring messages about ambient air quality, but also delivering some of the pieces of I guess understanding of what the state of ambient air quality is, and helping to parse some of the detailed technical speak with respect to what it means to become more stringent. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that. And Kevin, do you have anything to add from the airshed side, maybe?
I was going to say the one thing that probably throws a wrench into some things is that I know in certain jurisdictions, like not Alberta, but other jurisdictions are using the CAAQS in almost into the modeling guidelines, which wasn't the intent. So it really definitely puts it into a different light for some of that. So I know some people are interpreting it a different way. So it's really one of those tough ones to identify it. I put one of the links definitely in the presentation for the CCME, and that does give more of an infographic of things as well from the national stage to do that as well. So
perfect. Yeah, and post webinar, you know, Max or Kevin, if you do have any other links to more graphical ways to explain this to people, we're happy to share that out. It looks like you've brought something up there.
Yeah,
Matt,
I'll just really quickly just show, this is the condition of the environment website. So you can go to the website and there's multiple indicators. So there's air indicators, climate indicators, fish and wildlife, plants and water. Air is what we're interested in today. And so right now it's just the 4 CAAQS pollutants, but I think there's an intent to make this wider in the future. But just to show you an example of what kind of information there is, just to show you about what there is. There's various descriptions about things like variations and concentrations across the province, changes over time, seasonal variation, comparison to standards, comparisons at both a provincial scale and a national scale, as well as some of the limitations that are in here, as well as there's some figures. So a graphical depiction of concentrations over time, some variations with season, that kind of stuff. So a more interested way of looking into the data, as well as in some cases focus studies. So in this case, looking at fine particulate matter around forest fire events, and then there's some additional links. So I would maybe recommend this as almost a good starting point. So if you basically go, I'll go right back to the top here. It is alberta.ca and then condition of the environment.aspx. So you can kind of see the top there, but we can probably share that later on. That's a good place to start for some additional information.
Good, thanks for that. And I'll also a little bit jump in here on the question around the airshed role here. You know, anybody who has questions about air quality and air quality monitoring in the province, you know, if you're from that West Central Airshed area or Alberta Capital Airshed area, you know, by all means, give us a shout. You know, I will be happy to tap on Kevin's shoulder and be like, hey, Kevin, can you get us some data on this? And, you know, do our best to answer your questions or to help explain the processes and things that are in place. So that is one thing that as airsheds, we really try and do is have that great communication out there with the public. Okay, so
can I just add one more into that, Julie? And that was just like if you go onto the Alberta Airshed Council, like the website, the AAC website, that one is all of the airsheds together. So it's again a pathway to everybody, all the different airsheds in the province. So you would be able to see more information following through. So I know there's a few air quality reports there as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks for adding that in there. Okay, we have about 6 minutes left in this webinar. So although we have many more questions than that, I'm going to just pick one more, which is a little bit different than things that we've touched on so far, but still related to CAAQS, is how do CAAQS related actions sync with climate or greenhouse gas related actions? This is the last question of the day. So who would like to take that one? CAAQS actions and how they relate to greenhouse gas related actions.
Okay, I'll say one thing really quick. No, I'll just say one thing really quick. one of the questions I asked on my midterm was, what is better, cakes or greenhouse gases? So, so somebody read my midterm. I want to know who. And so, go ahead, Max, then I'll add something.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. So they're like, I guess the biggest thing I'll mention is that a lot of greenhouse gas pollutants are combustion related. And likewise, a lot of air pollutants are also combustion related. It's not all encompassing for either, but there are some significant connections in that sense. And so that as we make changes for one reason or another, in some sectors, climate change is really the thing that's driving reductions in combustion emissions. Likewise, doing combustion emission reductions for air quality management is also happening in other sectors. But synergistically, there is some benefit. There's rarely a case where reducing one increases the other. So as we consistently build the case for taking action on both fronts, we should see generally decreased greenhouse gas emissions as well as decreased pollutant emissions that result in poor air quality. Maybe the last thing I guess that I'll say is just that the scale can kind of depend on how we approach different impacts. Greenhouse gases generally are a global scale thing. We're comparing ourselves to other countries, that kind of thing. Whereas when it comes to air quality, it's generally on quite a local scale. And that map I showed at one point in my presentation gives that kind of sense. Air quality is quite a local thing, and it can vary fairly significantly from place to place. And Kevin's slides really showed that, right? That across the province, there's a lot of different concentrations experienced. So in some cases, we have to lean much more heavily on managing for air quality, which is the case, I think, in the capital region, because we know we have high concentrations and we know that managing for specific pollutants will help us improve air quality for everybody. But the knock-on benefit is likely that we're also going to be reducing greenhouse gases.
I was gonna say you hit it there with the energy efficiency type argument. If we look at the energy efficiency, we reduce emissions across the board in the span of it. So for sure.
Great, thank you both for your presentations and your ability to answer all those questions on the fly there. Before we wrap up this webinar, I do want to thank everyone who took the time to participate. We will be sending out that short feedback survey. This is the kickoff to our Clean Air webinar series. We want to hear from you so that we can improve our future webinars. If you would like to save the date, the next webinar in the Clean Air webinar series is scheduled for March 17th. From noon to 1 p.m. And the topic of that one will be how the provincial MER or MER and the AAAQO inform air quality work. And yes, we will have an explanation of those acronyms at that webinar as well. So with that, thank you again to our presenters. Thank you to Russ and Serena for working behind the scenes. And we'll see you on March 17th.